Okay, so welcome everybody to this third OASIS Lunchtime talk of the spring season 2023. Today we are diving into the world and research of nostalgia. More specifically, the cultural, socio-economical and ludological implications of nostalgia, and why and how to study nostalgia and its cultural objects. And to give the talk, we have here today Dr. Diego Mejía-Alandia. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. A visiting researcher here at the Tampere University, and whose research generally focuses on phenomena of memory and identity, especially cultural and national memory and individual and collective identity and their connection with material and popular cultures. So without further delay, take it away, Diego.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice presentation and the invitation too. Well, I will have to read a bit. So yeah, I think I never talked about myself so much in a presentation, so I will just start right away. These are the three small points that we will check on my presentation. So I'll talk you about a bit about my career path. Here I'll cover my career, but also talk a bit about the training and knowledge necessary to study nostalgia. Without getting too philosophical, I'm going to open this section with a bold statement. I would like to say that I love to learn, that for me the pursuit of knowledge is not only a philosophy of life, but also the only way I can understand human existence. And after this presentation, maybe you can judge if this is a bold statement or not. Said that, I would never recommend my career path to anyone to follow a career like mine. It's not only time consuming, but also depending on your location and education system, it can be real expensive and unrealistic. And although it won't necessarily destroy your social life, probably can be taxing for your family and significant other. So was my career path a direct path to game studies? Definitely not. But in a certain way, it was always a path to and through memory. Well, without getting too nostalgic, as far as family memories go, I always wanted to be a doctor. But that's a medical doctor, so there was an interesting difference there. So after years of future planning and to the surprise of my family, friends, and significant other, I started my college education in natural sciences. So I studied a bachelor degree in biology. But after a year, I got transferred to another university, to another city, where I was supposed to specialize in a different kind of memory and genetics. But soon after I started writing my bachelor thesis, I realized this was not for me. The research field was amazing, but because of the super competitive field, the environment was absolutely toxic. People would crush your skull and walk over your dead body in order to obtain better grades than you, to obtain funds or a position at the university. And I'm not joking. Cheating, sabotage, backstabbing, betraying friends, these were common practices in those days. So I asked to be transferred to another faculty. And I started a BA in literature. Here I basically specialized in Latin American literature, literary criticism, and creative writing. And also I started my personal research path in literature as memory, first as individual memory and then as collective memory. Well, then things happen, you know. I was about to start writing my bachelor thesis and I met a new partner. And soon after that, I decided to relocate again. So while I did that, it was not possible to keep my creative writing anymore, at least not the same way that I did up to this point. So I kept attending creative writing workshops, but I decided to continue my academic path, changing the course a bit. So I basically started a BA in German literature from zero. There I was introduced to the cultural legacy of the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, and its nostalgia, now the foundation of all my research. This led me to, well, a year studying abroad at the Humboldt University, and also get involved in a couple of interdisciplinary projects where I worked with literature, memory, and identity. Also, this led me to my first, to get my first research funds as an undergrad and my first academic papers. And also, this was the topic, well, I started writing with about memory and identity, migration, exile, intercultural literatures, and the Holocaust literature and intergenerational trauma was in the end the topic of my bachelor thesis. After completing my BA, I just started right away an MA in literary and cultural studies, where I followed my previous interests and delved deeper into the GDR's material and popular cultures, expanding my knowledge in film and music as forms of memory based on nostalgia. After completing my MA, I started working as a doctoral fellow at the University of Seville, working on filmic adaptations of GDR's nostalgic literature. Because the way of PhD studies work in Spain, where you don't have to start teaching right away, I decided to keep studying. So I started a master degree in translation and interculturality, where I specialize in video game translation and the translation of GDR's Culturem that was part of my MA thesis. So what's a Culturem? Well, this is the academic explanation. A Culturem is a social phenomena of a culture X that is regarded as relevant by the members of this culture, and when compared with a corresponding social phenomenon in a culture Y, is found to be specific to culture X. So in plain words, what does that mean? The best example in Finnish culture would be the word sisu. I could explain this word in Spanish, but we don't have an equivalent. So this is culturally absolutely Finnish. So after finishing my MA, my second MA, I taught literature, didactics, and analysis. I gave a master seminar on audiovisual translation, as well, especially video game translation, and also taught cinema and literature, a subject that serves as an introduction to film analysis, particularly of filmic adaptations of literature. Well, since my corpus was growing so faster than expected, and now I needed some cultural background, I decided to travel again and expand my approach. So I was going back to Germany, but I decided to go farther. And I did a research day in the University of Warsaw, where I studied a more Eastern European approach to post-communist nostalgia. Which brings me to something that not long ago Dr. Jolien Blom was talking about. It's at this point you're trying to get funds and how difficult it is to try to explain fieldwork, because I didn't know what was I going to expect, what I was going to find in Poland. But that was my actual explanation. I mean, that's what I put in my project. I explained my always supportive supervisor and the non-supportive uni administration. I'm going to Poland because I don't know their experience of nostalgia. And believe it or not, that funded me. So there I discovered the Polish jazz scene, and an amazing scene that was completely alien to most of communist countries because, of course, this was forbidden. And I was introduced to the fascinating Polish cinema history and the really complex relationship that they have with nostalgia. And I would say that this is a must. If you want to study cultural objects, you need to know a lot about popular culture, and even more about history, and if possible, try to find pleasure doing this kind of research. Well, since I got so involved with film studies, I managed to get some funds and try to study and expand my research on manifestations of, well, other kinds of manifestations of nostalgia. So I was invited to collaborate in this project that was about the films of Jorge Sanginés, one of the most important Bolivian directors and a really important figure in the Latin American cinema of the past century. And, well, I still had time before the pandemic stroke to travel a bit. So I visited Germany once more. And when I came back to Spain, it was less than 24 hours before they closed the borders. So I was just in the limit. And at this time, I was busy reviewing around 200 movies for my thesis. And I was working on an analysis that ended up including around 70 films for the final corpus, plus around 30 films, reference films, that also were included. As you can imagine, I was absolutely stressed. Thank you, COVID. I was in the last year of my contract with the University of Seville, and I was single again after a 10-year relationship breakup. So, of course, each of us finds a way to cope, or found a way to cope with the pandemic and the COVID thing, with the lockdown. So basically, solely on evidence, what do you think I did? Anyone?
Work more.
Yes! I started another MA. I was crazy. I like to study. So yes, I started an MA on script writing, narrativity, and audiovisual creativity, really pompous names. Here I not only returned to my creative writing, but I also studied the fundamentals of game design, and I found some new theoretical grounds for my PhD thesis in my last year of writing my thesis. So it was horrible. And then, well, after all this work, going so far deep and into film studies and script writing, I somehow thought that games were my next logical step. So as soon as I presented my PhD thesis, I secured new mentor, new research group. I was looking for game studies programs, postdoctoral grants, and all that jazz. Applied, of course, and Tampere was on top of my list. And, well, here I am. So this was my path. It was crazy. So before continuing, I would like to mention that all of this was possible because of my grades, because of my research, writing, and because of the way of the Spanish system works. And possibly this wouldn't be possible in other systems. So just to give you an example, if you get a perfect score in a subject, you don't have to pay your next subject. If you are the best of your class on 1 year, you don't have to pay for the next year. Or if you are the best of your class in your BA program, you don't have to pay for your MA program. So basically, if you are a really good student, you won't pay at all in our system. And gladly, even if you need to pay, Andalusia has the lowest fees in the country, I think. But, you know, it was amazing, but it was also thanks to that. So let's talk about replaying cultural memory. Well, I'm starting this section with a quote that probably you will all know, that I would like you to keep in mind. It's who controls the past, around the party slogan. controls the future? Who controls the present, controls the past? Writes George Orwell when he tries to explain the concepts of reality control and doublethink in his cautionary novel 1984, published in 1949. So this is basically what I do with my research. I mean, I don't control the past, of course, or the future, but instead I study the means, strategies, and discourses of both past and future, and the way they are controlled, but not by the party this time, or neither by propaganda, but how you control the past or the future of an individual or a collective with this. Well, you play or replay with cultural memory. So let's start with the basics. What is cultural memory and how can we play with it? Well, so allow me to explain memory. According to Jan and Aleida Assmann, perhaps two of the most relevant and living scholars in memory studies, what happened with neurology and psychology is that they studied the internal dimension of memory, of human memory. That means that they focus on the brain and its processes, but they didn't study the contents of this memory. So the Assmanns talk about these contents in terms of most of the times these contents depend on external conditions and not internal conditions. So they call this condition external dimensions of human memory. And those are based on cultural and historical studies and don't have anything to do with the brain directly. And well, these are basically the contents of our memory and how we use our memory. And cultural memory is just one of those dimensions. So the first dimension that they talk about, it's called mimetic memory. This refers to action, since we learn different forms of behavior through imitation, including everyday manners, customs, or ethics, or through the use of written instructions relating to machinery, cooking, construction, and of course, gaming. The second is the memory of things. So we humans have been always surrounded with things, from private everyday objects such as beds, chairs, toys, clothes, and to tools, to houses, streets, villages, towns, cars, and more recently, video games. As Jan Assmann points out, they all represent our concepts of practicality, comfort, beauty, and to a certain extent, our own identity. Objects themselves reflect ourselves, right? They remind us of who we are, of our past, of our forebears, and so on. The world of things in which we live has a time index that refers not only to our present, but also and simultaneously to different phases and levels of our past. The third dimension is communicative memory. This refers to language and the ability to communicate our inner self and interexchange memory with others in our everyday life interactions. This could be something as simple as you trying to share your memory of a game with a younger sibling, or to talk about your family memories to a younger generation. Sorry. Oh. So finally, we get to cultural memory. What is cultural memory? It's the handing down of meaning. It's a perfect fusion of the other three aspects, when mimetic routines, objects, and discourses take on the status of rituals that assume a meaning and significance that go beyond their practical function, transcending the borders of mimetic action memory. Rituals, says Jan Assmann, are part of cultural memory because they are the form through which cultural meaning is both handed down and brought to present life. The same applies to things once they point to a meaning that goes beyond their practical purpose. Symbols, icons, representations such as monuments, tombs, temples, idols, and so forth all transcend the borders of object memory because they make implicit index time and identity explicit. Okay, so up to this point, let me argue that, well, video games are precisely that. As cultural objects and as part of our cultural memory, they not only make implicit index time explicit, since we can date them culturally. First, think about the proper medium. We can date a game based on the fact that it comes in a cartridge, on a CD, on a DVD, etc., but also by technology or aesthetics. If we think about text-based games, 8-bit, 16-bit, 32, 42, 40, 64, sorry, and of course VR, but also think about mimetic routines and the process of learning how to play. We need constantly to use and read manuals or tutorials. You need to train your brain and your hands in order to use a controller by repetition, and most of the times even by the creation of your own rituals of play. And games even produce their own rituals and practices. That's why we recognize the difference between a Souls-like game and a roguelike, for example. And we can see, even if their aesthetics, discourses, or narratives are a far cry from the games they got their inspiration, we can recognize them. Also think of identity. How many of you are wearing a video game related accessory? A t-shirt, a backpack, a nickname. These objects, even if trivial for the rest of the world, give us a sense of belonging and shape our identity. And in our case, even guide our career and educational decisions. Okay, now, just a sec. I know this is a lot of information, but try to keep all of this in the back of your head. And forget about the present. Forget about the games you're playing and researching right now. And think about the games of the past that led you to this point. Your first gaming experience, that life-changing LARP, that game that made you cry. You have a story, a personal or family memory there. Now imagine, I know this will be harder, but please bear with me. Let's try memory exercise here. Imagine that you could play with this experience. I mean, not with the game of your childhood, but to play with the circumstances that led you to the discovery of that game. What about if you could replay your experience of the past? Because even if you had a happy childhood, there's probably something you lost there, something you want to recover, or even better, something you want to forget. For instance, I can tell you how I started my adventure in video games. My parents were always supportive in anything related to arts and education, but for my own surprise, they also introduced me to the world of video games when they got me and my younger brother our first console, an Atari 2600, and a fair amount of games when we were young kids. Although I never asked or received another console before or after that Atari, I was lucky enough to have access to almost every console while growing up, as well as to enjoy and spend way too much money in the arcade world before its demise. But what was my first gaming experience? Probably a pinball machine. Which one, of course, I can't remember, but that's not important. But because, as Svetlana Boym reminds us, contemporary nostalgia is a longing for a home that no longer exists or has never existed. This means that most of our nostalgic memories are personal, familiar, or collective fictions. They are not true. They are not meant to be true. So they are fictions that we tend to maintain as a nostalgic love relationship with time and space. A relationship that we keep alive not despite distance, but because of it, because we cannot reach them anymore. And at the core, that's the meaning of nostalgia. Okay, but how do we apply all of this to video games? My pompous research project description says, I study representations of post-communist nostalgia in video games, VR, and digital experiences. But what does that mean in real life? Well, right now I have a corpus of around 30 games, but depending on how do you classify these games, I could have a lot more. So I'll show you two basic classifications of post-communist nostalgic representations, and I'll talk about their similarities and their differences. We can talk about representations of, sorry, what happened there? Okay. We can talk about two kinds of representations: nostalgia and ostalgia, without an N. But I'll go back to that, so don't worry. As for their similarities, both convey a sense of pastness. I mean, it's not real past, but it looks like past, by the depiction of fashion, imagery, soundscape, and stereotypes culturally associated to an era. In this case, this sense of pastness means that through the use of objects, usually music and other kinds of paraphernalia, style means authenticity. And this produces what we would call an aesthetic freezing process. For instance, they produce an everlasting decade, such as the Soviet Stalinist era of the 50s, like it happens in Command and Conquer Red Alert 3. Or the image of an East Germany forever frozen in the 70s, as it happens in Industria and almost every movie based on the GDR. Or, of course, the timeless James Bond aesthetics of the Cold War in, well, every 007 game. So what about their differences? When we talk about plain nostalgic representations, we need, of course, to recreate the visuals and acoustic aesthetics of the Cold War period, but only to a certain point that we will call aesthetic colonization. That means that the style needs to have the connotation of authenticity, that adds an aura or patina of pastness to the framing, but in exchange, there's no social or political commentary beyond the stereotypes and common knowledge of popular culture. To put this simple, these representations create a setting in a manner of a TV or a movie set that can be used and reused over and over again with no social implications or consequences. This is your average Cold War game. On the other hand, representations of nostalgia work differently and go way farther. But what is nostalgia? An oversimplified and commonly accepted version of the concept would be this: nostalgia is the longing of various aspects of everyday life in the times of the former GDR by its former citizens. Coined in Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, this concept was applied to nostalgic literature and cinema, and soon other countries started their own understanding of the phenomenon. In order to use it with different kinds of representations, I proposed and updated this concept for my PhD thesis. So this is the concept that I proposed. Well, what is nostalgia then? I proposed that nostalgia is actually a form of memory. and a product of the sociopolitical, cultural, mnemonic, and identitary processes derived from the fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the USSR. So it's also a non-conventional cognitive affective experience based on imagination, performance, parody, and irony. And so just as happens with irony, nostalgia is not something that exists in the text or in a game, but rather something that happens within the reader. That means that you are the one producing nostalgia and not the game. So to give you some context on how nostalgic representations work, that means how we read nostalgia in these representations, I'll show you some of the characteristics of in the games that I'm studying. First, these representations, they're to portray alternative, inverted, or distorted recreations of national pasts and deal with actual social issues regarding national memory. This way, they can even project their representations far into the future or talk about the present or different societies. Setting an alternative dystopian, far technologically advanced universe, Black the Fall recreates the Romanian uprising of December 1989, also known as the Christmas Revolution, the one that led to the execution of Nicolae Ceausescu and the fall of 42 years of communist regime. In the game, instead of leading a worker or a peasant into freedom, we control a robot that, as a metaphor, inverts the oppressive mechanics of the regime, updating and extrapolating the experience of the Romanian Revolution to Western societies, showing how humans live a conformist life in a system they don't believe in, and yet they never act. Finally, in the game, this robot is the one that gets tired of the system and decides to escape, while humans are treated and used as mindless machines by the regime. Set in 1989, in an alternative Soviet Union ruled by the Russian mafia, Le Cartel Studio, the French developers behind Mother Russia Bleeds, use a group of Roscoe Roma, just a Russian gypsy minority, as an excuse to talk about the government repression, social control, and freedom of speech in their home country. The outcome is an ultra-violent version of Russia, filled with corruption, drugs, BDSM, and gore, that portrays a semi-post-apocalyptic scenario a la Mad Max, mixed with some 16-bit era beat-em-up aesthetics and mechanics. Of course, both social issues portrayed are real, and the overlap does not seem to be affected by time or space displacement. Well, second, these representations are open to social or political commentary that embraces parody and irony. Set in 1984 in an Orwellian communist regime, in People's Committee of Game Development, we need to build a small studio and design a game that needs to be sold, but that also needs to be propaganda for the ideology of the state and, of course, be approved by censorship. While the game sounds like an excellent parodic idea, the irony behind it is that this actually happened. In the last decade of the Eastern Bloc, various countries opened their markets to socialist and rock and pop music. That, of course, was forbidden because of the American influence that they had. In this situation, national studios managed by the party had to deal with the same issues. The artists need to look edgy but not rebellious. The music catchy but not against the system. They should not portray capitalistic values, but they needed to sell. And so on. I mean, all of this actually happened in a lot of countries. Third, as good postmodern objects, these games promote a dialogue between memory, history, and popular culture by the means of intertextuality. Set in the 60s, Little Orpheus is a game that explores an even more specific kind of representation called space nostalgia, or the nostalgia for the lost future that the space exploration race promised. Little Orpheus reimagines the foundational myths of the Soviet Union through the exploration of an array of lush mythological but post-apocalyptic landscapes taken from Soviet and Russian folklore. This way, the game portrays failed utopian discourses that work as an allegory of the dystopian outcome of the Soviet project, both in social and environmental terms. In this sense, the game's apocalyptic landscapes proved that indeed utopia was not only not possible in the past, but even less possible in the proto-socialist past of the Soviet Union's foundational myths. So finally, to show you the extent of the external dimensions of memory in relation to gaming nostalgia and the replaying of cultural memory, I want you to consider one last example. Set in the fictional Soviet Republic of Ashtorska, in the year 1982, Papers, Please uses our mimetic memory, turning our actions efficiently mechanical, almost if we were working in an assembly line, processing people's destinies and controlling the movement of apparently subaltern bodies across the Republic's border. Although we cannot touch the game, the way the memory of things is used here is familiar to everyone. Moreover, if you're an immigrant, IDs, passports, stamps, permits, they may not look the same as the ones we carry, but their social implications still remain. Likewise, the communicative memory anchors the game to family history. I mean, we all had migration history in our families, or the experience of a close friend, or even popular culture, since most of the actual history that we consume after high school comes almost exclusively from a fictional source. Books, films, video games, and not from actual history books or research. This way, in terms of cultural memory, in Papers, Please, we are not only forced to take inhuman or at least unethical decisions in order to fulfill our tasks, since the game explores ideology as a system of procedures and conducts to be endured, internalized, perfected, and perhaps subverted with counter-conduct, which is, of course, the definition of a ritual. But we also play a ritual that uses the discourses and aesthetics of the time the game uses as a setting, which is, at the same time, a meta-discourse of the past within the history of gaming. Portraying a double commentary of old and current immigration policies and practices, Papers, Please is critical to the present, but by the use of mechanics and aesthetics of the past, it gives people that lived that time the chance to be retroactively rebellious, emulating its media itself as a message. Because talking about political discourses, the script of the game would have made this almost impossible to publish in the 80s. No major publisher or hardware manufacturer would have sold Papers, Please in the 80s. Not in America, not in Japan, and even less in any of the Eastern European countries that it uses as a template. Likewise, think of Access. Even with an underground distribution, something that would have been quite dangerous for the developers, how many people could have they reached? Since most of the computers of the time belonged to the regimes, belonged to the system. Okay, what happened there? Okay, that's not correct. In conclusion, why should we study these representations? Because from an aesthetic and political standpoint, and in the case of Papers, Please or Black Default, even mechanical, these representations of nostalgia allow us to approach, experience, and ultimately play with cultural memory of former communist societies, or even replay them if we have a personal memory of these spaces. Of course, this simple fact may seem trivial to some, but the social, cultural, historical, and mnemonic implications can be huge for the collectives reflected in the games. Because just as Orwell's slogan, give me a sec. Because just as Orwell's slogan, thanks to these games, who controls the past? Who controls the present, sorry, controls the past. So this is a way, depending on how do you research these games, that these collectives can use the games to rework their own memory based on their political experiences of the past. And well, that's why I study them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Diego, for the interesting, insightful presentation. I think there are a lot of sort of connections to be made sort of all over gaming culture from these topics. But are there immediate audience questions now rising, or there is?
Okay, thanks for the presentation. This is the right side of the box. Okay, I was wondering if during this research period you found any connections between this representation of a Soviet past or a communist past and the connection with transitional justice processes in some of these countries, like how these games are, or what do these games tell when they're situated in the context of a dispute about memory? Like, is this the right way to remember, or and so on?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question. I don't think so far there's any governmental research, because, well, I tend to use this example. In Germany, there is, I mean, since nostalgia was such an important matter, I mean, it's social, cultural, and economic matter. So there are research about how these movies, how the culture of nostalgia influences in the society. As far as gaming, I haven't seen any kind of research of that sort. But also the issue is that unless you have political movement, that means that you need to have enough, a big enough corpus, I would say. Let's say the Romanian example. It's one game. I'm not saying one game cannot change things, but it's just one. And if you look at the representations of cinema, nostalgic cinema in Germany, I studied more than 200 films, and the actual things that I thought were important enough to be in my thesis were 70, and they keep going. They are still doing those films, and it will, well, that still will happen in the future. So it's a different point. I mean, and it's not only about the movies. I'm sure you can find hundreds of books of that period in Germany. And in the case of literature, probably there are studies like that in some other countries. But at the same time, depending on the country you're talking about, because every country has different reality, they don't have an actual history of transition. And that's actually something that I studied for a paper. For instance, I don't know if you were at the You saw my presentations on the seminar, spring seminar. Spain and Russia, they didn't have a transition. I mean, they have this transitional period, but it was, okay, we are a regime, authoritarian regime. Now we're not. But there are nobody to blame. Nothing. I mean, some things were bad in the past, but let's not talk about it. And some countries, like for instance Romania, I mean, the people took the palace, so they actually killed Ceausescu on site. You can talk about justice there, but that's a different kind of justice. So I don't know. I don't think there are enough, and also that depends on the location. For instance, I have 5 games that talk about space nostalgia, all talk about Soviet space nostalgia, specifically Russian, but only one of those games is actually made in Russia. So are they talking about the games produced in the country? Are they receiving these content from outside? Then we talk about limitations of distribution. It's really complicated. And I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah.
Thanks. Really fascinating talk and topic. I was thinking that there are probably a lot of these kind of developments where the original memory is fading. That, for example, if we are talking about the objects that are attached to Soviet Union or even to Nazi Germany, people might be just drawn to collect them, for example, for aesthetic reasons, sort of losing the original context. So do you see the nostalgic developments that you are studying somehow related also of this kind of losing of the original context or original memory, as well as the opposite of trying to keep the original sort of historical framework and reality alive?
Well, I've seen, yeah, the issues, if you talk about post-communist nostalgia, I haven't seen preservation, not in the same way, because although they use materials, they normally use their original materials. But on the other hand, I mean, I have the perfect example of that is this. If you don't recognize it, that's Atomic Heart. And if you, this is the introduction scene. If you play this, it's maybe actually the same. And yeah, there's a recent issue about the preservation of this imagery, and it's actually with this game. There's a lot of controversy behind it, precisely because of that, because they are using actual propaganda. It's not fictional propaganda they are creating. And in the case of the real world, this is the crazy part. For instance, in where the biggest markets that are Russia and Germany, you can find replicas of almost anything related to paraphernalia of the Cold War era. And most of those are made in China, and they are made for tourists, and people take them like that. I mean, in Russia, they even have a term for that. They call it Soviet kitsch. So you can buy uniforms, caps, all these medals and all that stuff, and they are readily available on flea markets. And we can even, well, in Germany even they call it the memory market, because you can go to a flea market that is basically half of the things that they have are things from the GDR time. And most of them are not even real. I mean, there are replicas, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for your interesting talk. I have two probably short questions. The first question I probably already asked, but I completely forgot. Did you somehow study Beholder, both first and second part?
No.
Okay, that's probably one thing to consider. Why precisely what precisely reminded me about this game is Papers, Please, because in Russian-speaking communities, these two games are usually connected in minds of people who have some even experience of childhood in years of last years of Soviet regime. So it's quite strange because they are completely different, but there is this connection for them. And another question, did you somehow use, or probably you could find the term that I don't think it exists correctly in English, but its name can be translated as a cranberry bush or wheaten tree or cranberry tree.
No, I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that.
Because there is a specific, talking about Soviet nostalgia from viewpoint of Russian-speaking community, which I sadly and inevitably had to face for many years. I noticed that difference that is usually seen between, for example, American films about Soviet Union and Russian films about Soviet Union. And this difference is usually put in the word klukva, which is cranberry tree exactly. And it's like, I won't go into this deep, but it's also about changes of views on this past by playing games, games that the community from former Soviet Union can see as klukva are usually not perceived as seriously and as nostalgic because they are seen as a bad kind of irony, as distortion of their past. And Red Alert within that community is one of that examples that shouldn't be perceived because it's distortion of great Soviet past.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, my second question has to do with this idea of transnational cultural memory. I saw one of your slides that said that these games have value for people that has experienced this phenomena, and then they have the ability to replay this phenomena. But what have you found in your research about this transnational cultural memory, like the idea of creating this memory about a place that I haven't known or a social phenomena that I haven't experienced, but I still feel that it's kind of my memory and it belongs to me. Also relating it to like this Soviet kitsch that you mentioned, which I think it's kind of big in these web pages.
Well, yeah, if you think about cultural objects that we consume every day, basically American cinema do of the Ruska Roma, the minority they are talking about, and they have a really complicated history in Russia, and even more complicated during the Soviet era. So I'm not sure how to respond to that. I would think that, again, if we reach a point where I can tell you I have 50 games about this specific event or this specific country, maybe we can discuss and try to reach gamers or create a focus group or something. But before that, I think it's hard. Or for instance, this wait, I had one. Yeah, this game, Little Orpheus.
Okay, it looks like we don't have any other immediate questions now, and it's close to 1. So I think it's as good time as any to wrap up and give one more round of applause to Dr.